The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to Urban Fantasies, your fortnightly fix of weird tales, urban legends, magic, and folklore. And now here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
It's Thursday night, it's late, and hello to all our listeners in Paranormal Radioland. I'm Charles Christian, and with me is Janie.
Hi everyone, we've got a packed show tonight, and we're kicking off with our usual What Happened on This Weird Day in History, Thursday, 19th October.
We start with the man rated to be the baddest and most evil king England has ever seen, and we've had some stinkers through the centuries, finally popping his clogs. Yes, in the year 1216, King John of England died at the age of 49, after a career whose highlights included personally murdering his 16-year-old nephew, Prince Arthur, losing the crown jewels in the Wash, and I did say Wash, not washing. For American listeners, the Wash is a geographic area of East England, being forced to agree to the Magna Carta, being excommunicated by the Pope, and having a papal interdict placed on the entire country, which meant that for 5 years nobody could receive a church christening, marriage or funeral service. He finally died of a surfeit of peaches, although it's probably dysentery.
A surfeit of peaches? Were deaths by surfeits a thing in the Middle Ages?
Apparently so, among the royals. John's great-grandfather, King Henry I, died from eating a surfeit of lampreys, which are a rather gruesome type of eel. Anyway, thank you and good night, King John, who today is probably best remembered as being, along with the Sheriff of Nottingham, the arch enemy of the legendary Robin Hood.
Oh, and anything else of note happened this day?
Well, in his diary, Samuel Pepys records that on the 19th of October 1660, the decorators finally finished his living room, which was done out in green serge and gilt leather, which is very handsome. Those are Pepys' words, not mine. Then, in the afternoon, he went to Charing Cross to watch Colonel Daniel Axel and Colonel Francis Hacker being executed by being hanged, drawn and quartered after being convicted of regicide for their part in the trial and beheading of King Charles I. In the evening he did some bookkeeping and was pleased to discover his boss owed him the equivalent of £12,000 in back pay, petty cash and expenses.
Is that where the saying, nothing is certain in this life but death and taxes comes from, I wonder? And that brings us neatly round to this week's haunting. Our candidate is Elizabeth Betty Potter of Boxted in Essex, who manifests every year at midnight on the 21st of October, haunting a bend in the Colchester Road, now known as Betty Potter's Dip. So what do we know about Betty?
One version of the story is Betty committed suicide at some point during the 18th century and, as was the custom in those days when dealing with suicides, or self-murderers as they were known, she was buried late at night in unhallowed ground on the outskirts of her village by a crossroads, so her poor ghost now haunts the site of her burial.
Oh, that's sad. You said one version of the story. What's the other one?
The other one is a little bit more exciting, dates back a century earlier to 1646, when the notorious witch-finder general Matthew Hopkins was operating in this part of England. Betty Potter, who lived in a small cottage near what is known as Betty Potter's Dip, was Boxted's own witch. She was reputed to have cured the sick daughter of a wealthy Colchester merchant, for which she was well rewarded. However, she is also said to have bewitched a team of horses pulling a wagon of wheat from Rivers Hall, one of the two big manor houses in Boxted, to the mill at Mile End near Colchester. Although Matthew Hopkins had learned of Betty's activities and was planning to bring her to trial, the son of the owner of Rivers Hall took the law into his own hands, organised a lynch mob who broke into her cottage, seized poor Betty Potter and hanged her from a nearby tree.
Oh, do remind me then not to drive along that road late night in October.
You drive a Land Rover Discovery. They're so solidly built they're impervious to spectral manifestations. Anyway, unlike Samuel Pepys, we have not had the studio decorated in green serge and gilded leather. However, one of our career highlights this week was going for our annual flu jab and consequently immediately feeling we'd gone down with a cold.
Yes, and that prompted me to do a little digging into the folklore surrounding colds and sneezes. Now, there's long been a suggestion that the custom of saying bless you when someone sneezes dates back to the Great Plague of 1665, as sneezing was an early warning that someone might be going down with the plague. But a quick rifle through the reference books reveals that, according to Pliny, the Romans were saying the equivalent of bless you at least 1600 years earlier.
Pliny, that'll be Pliny the Elder, the Roman author, naturalist, philosopher, military commander and general purpose good egg. Did you know he died trying to rescue friends when the Mount Vesuvius volcano erupted and destroyed the city of Pompeii?
Yes, the very same one. Anyway, what I also discovered is that sneezing is also used as the basis of a form of divination. For example, to sneeze once is a sign of good luck, while sneezing twice is unlucky. And the early Christian bishop, Saint Augustine of Hippo, and frankly you'd have thought he'd had more important things to worry about, mentions a superstition that if you sneeze while you're putting on your shoes, you should go back to bed again. And there's also this little day's rhyme about sneezing I found. It goes like this: sneeze on Monday, sneeze for danger. Sneeze on Tuesday, kiss a stranger. Sneeze on Wednesday, get a letter. Sneeze on Thursday, something better. Sneeze on Friday, sneeze for sorrow. Sneeze on Saturday, see your love tomorrow.
What happens on Sunday then?
Yeah, that's not so good. The rhyme says, sneeze on Sunday, your safety seek, for the devil will have you the rest of the week. Still, there again, as most people have to go back to school or work on a Monday, the sentiments behind the Sunday's rhymes, I suppose, are understandable.
Thank you, Janie. Speak to you later in the show. Talking of anniversaries, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that last week, October the 12th to be precise, was the 142nd anniversary of the birth of the notorious English occultist Aleister Crowley, who was born in 1875. The man who put the final K into the word magic, Crowley always insisted he was not a Satanist, but he still took great pleasure in being known as the wickedest man in the world and the great beast 666. 666, hang on. That number rings a bell. Oh yes, last 3 digits of my own phone number. Anyway, do what thou wilt was Crowley's recipe for life, and he certainly did. Among other things, he climbed 2 of the highest mountains in the world, K2 and Kachinjunga. He worked as a double agent for British intelligence to discredit Germany during World War I. He also started or was involved with a number of occult lodges, including the Golden Dawn, Templis Orientis and the Abbey of Thelema, but managed to offend so many people that they asked him to leave. He also fought and lost a magic battle with the Irish poet and later Nobel Prize winner William Butler Yeats. Thanks to spending on average 3 times his income every year, Crowley also managed to squander an inherited fortune, had permanent money problems in later life and died in debt. He was an advocate of sex magic. Never mind do what thou wilt. In fact, do who thou wilt would have been a better motto for him, as he pretty much did it with everyone, male or female, who presented an opportunity. Apparently his first sexual encounter was with a family maid when he was just 14. The maid was subsequently fired and, according to legend, later became one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. Crowley died a penniless heroin addict in 1947. And when his doctor refused to renew his prescription for morphine, one of his final acts was to place a curse on his doctor, who then died within 24 hours of Crowley. His picture is one of the many that appear on the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's album cover in 1967. He's top left, next to Mae West. Weird to think that it was only 20 years between Crowley's death and Sgt. Pepper, but but is now 50 years between Sergeant Pepper and today. And, keeping with the rock connection, Crowley once owned Bullskin House next to Loch Ness. Jimmy Page, the guitarist with Led Zeppelin, who had a well-known fascination with the occult and Crowley, bought it in 1970 and owned it for 20 years, though he rarely stayed there. The house was pretty much destroyed by a fire in 2015. Spooky coincidence that, as Borley Rectory, which once had a reputation for being the most haunted house in England, was also destroyed by a fire.
You're listening to Urban Fantasist with Charles Christian on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
If you go down to the woods today... Well, I'm not sure about surprises, but being the autumn, you will certainly encounter fairy rings. And while we're on the subject of mysterious things found in woods, you'd better also watch out for the legendary woodwoes and the Slender Man. Let's start with fairy rings. Sitting here in the 21st century with the benefits of science and botany at our disposal, we know that fairy rings, or fairy circles, or elf circles, or even pixie rings, are naturally occurring rings or arcs of mushroom and fungus. There are actually about 60 different types of mushroom that can grow into a fairy ring. We also know they can grow very rapidly, overnight in some instances, and that on meadows and grasslands they can have a necrotic effect on the grass, so cattle and sheep won't graze on them. But let's rewind 150 years to a time when education and literacy was still the exception and superstition was the norm. Faced with the overnight appearance of a ring of mushrooms that animals avoided, what would you think? In the circumstances, it's hardly surprising fairy circles have become the subject of folklore, stretching back hundreds of years. In fact, the Middle English term elferingwort, or elfring, meaning a ring caused by elves dancing, dates back over 900 years. Almost all folklore says fairy rings are dangerous places, and that it is bad luck for a mortal to step into one, and that you will die at a young age, or if you're engaged in criminal activities, you will end your days on the gallows. However, the richest source of legend and folklore, to be found pretty much consistently all across the British Isles and Western Europe, Central Asia, China and even Japan, relates to humans who have been lured into a ring by fairies to join their dance and then are either never seen again or else suffer some kind of strange Rip Van Winkle time distortion effect whereby they think they've only been gone a few hours or perhaps just overnight, whereas in the real world months or perhaps years have elapsed. It's weird to think people were telling stories like this with strange time lapses several hundred years before Einstein formulated his special theory of relativity and space-time dilation, which has since become the standard trope for science fiction movies, with the hero returning to Earth, like Charlton Heston in Planet of the Apes, only to discover everyone he knew is dead and the world changed beyond recognition. Here's a little rhyme that sums up the experience of the supernatural time lapse in fairyland and fairy rings. They caroused, they feasted, that a month had flown, they knew not, that a year had gone by, they knew not. As a year went by, it seemed like a day, as 2 years went by, it seemed like 2 days, as 3 years went by, it seemed like 3 days. When someone finally escapes or else is dragged by a friend out of a fairy ring, they find the real world has changed, that their girlfriends have gone off and married someone else, that their homes are now occupied by strangers, and they also tend to fall victim to accelerated aging. There are a lot of folk tales that end with the dancer crumbling to dust the first time and it is almost always a man who is foolhardy enough to join the elves dancing in a ring, the first time he eats mortal food again or hears church bell ringings. And spare a thought for poor old King Hurler, a legendary British king who ruled about the same time as King Arthur. When he and some of his courtiers, returning from what they thought was a 3-day wedding feast with some elves, he discovered he'd been gone for over 200 years, and that not only was his queen long dead, but his kingdom had been taken over by invading Saxons, and the people now spoke a different language. It's said the king and his men are still riding today, as they know that if they ever dismount from their horses, they will immediately crumble to dust. Incidentally, if you do want to confuse the fairies so they can't pull you into their ring, apparently you should wear your hat back to front. This presumably is why so many people today wear their baseball caps back to front. And if you want to investigate a fairy ring and hear the sound of the fairies dancing, run around it 9 times. According to a tradition in Northumberland, part of England, and it's a 20th century tradition, so we're only looking 100 years ago, this running must be done under a full moon, and the runner must travel in the direction of the sun, in other words, clockwise. To go widdershins, anti-clockwise, would allow the fairies to place the runner under their sway, and naturally to circle the ring a 10th time is very foolhardy and dangerous. In my introduction, I also mentioned the wood woes. The wood what? I know, none of those weird, crazy English folk legends. Okay, let's set the scene. We're into cryptozoology here. Now, the UK is famous for having what is probably the best known cryptid on the planet, the Loch Ness Monster. Coming a close second, however, are those relict hominids, the Yeti, aka the abominable snowman of the Himalayas, and the North American Sasquatch, aka Bigfoot. However, the UK has its own version, the woodwoes. Basically, this translates as the hairy wild man of the woods. You'll find him depicted in statues and carvings in medieval churches across the English county of Suffolk, which is just down the road from this studio. Although the carvings were made 800 years ago, there have been reported sightings of the woodwoes in far more recent times in this part of England, particularly in the autumn when the sun is low and the light is starting to fade on an afternoon. The most recent sighting I've heard of was in 2015. There have also been similar reports of wild men coming from the more mountainous areas of Spain. So what is the woodwoes? Although there is a suggestion that in earlier times the reported sightings of woodwoes may have simply been Celts and Britons who'd been displaced by the invading Saxons, being forced to live on the margins of society, in forests and in wild places, this is clearly not a viable explanation in the 21st century. So is it some unknown form of hominid? One of the distant cousins of us Homo sapiens, or a descendant of the Neanderthals? We'll be coming back to this in a later show. Finally, I also mentioned in my list of surprises you might encounter in the woods today, the notorious Slender Man. Now, it's well known the Slender Man began as an internet meme in June 2009, when a competition on a comedy web forum, Something Awful, asked for ideas for a modern myth with which to terrify people. One contributor responded by posting 2 faked photographs purporting to come from the mid-1980s, showing a tall, sinister figure lurking behind a group of children. The person submitting it also attached some vague text suggesting 14 young people and the photographer had gone missing. Despite being clearly an internet age fake urban legend, fiction has merged with fact, and we've seen a number of criminal cases, including 2 young teenage girls who attempted to stab to death a friend as an offering to the Slender Man. Their case is still rumbling on through the US court system, so we won't comment on that. But now there's been another twist in the merging of myth and reality. It's really now become a case of folklore, L-O-R-E, becoming embroiled in folklore, L-A-W. A new academic paper studying the intellectual property status of internet folklore argues that online community-created works are in the commons and suggests that claims of ownership under both copyright and trademark law harm the public by depriving it of more creative works. The research focuses primarily on Slender Man and predicts the release of a major Hollywood movie next year could lead to various publishing houses and movie houses seeking to exclusively own the horror character. The study, entitled Beware the Slender Man, Intellectual Property and Internet Folklore, is due to be published in the Florida Law Review later this year. Its author is Cathay Smith, an assistant professor of law at the University of Montana's Alexander Blewett School of Law. While the study ostensibly focuses on the IP protection that should or should not be afforded to folklore created on the internet, the majority of the paper focuses on Slender Man, a pale, tentacled, well-dressed horror character created in 2009. Due to the collaborative way that the Slender Man was created, it has been described by some commentators as a crowdsourced monster and the first great myth of the web. It is most often referred to as a creepypasta, which is an internet term for short horror stories. Both Slenderman and creepypasta were cited as inspirations for the notorious stabbing in Wisconsin in 2014, and this led to a statement defending the work by the character's original creator, Eric Knudsen, the person who first posted the images of Slenderman on the Something Awful forums. Whilst Knudsen admits he has not actually been behind much of the fiction and artwork inspired by it, he subsequently sought exclusive ownership, including registering copyright. Production company Mythology Entertainment subsequently acquired these rights from Knudsen to use the character in movies, television, publications, video games, and started sending cease and desist letters to content creators of Slender Man-related movie and video games. It's further announced last year that Mythology is working with Sony on a movie based on the character, which is due out next year sometime. It is in this environment that the author of the paper decided to analyse the IP protection being claimed on Slenderman. She found a number of word and design trademark applications, both registered and awaiting examination, filed by the applicants, including Mythology Entertainment and It Is No Dream Entertainment, covering a wide variety of goods and services. These marks, she claims, are being filed in anticipation of the movie and further capitalisation on the Slenderman law, suggesting the production companies are attempting to clear the way to exclusively own and use Slender Man. Due to the uptick in IP filings and cease and desist letters, Smith, the author of the paper, also discovered dozens of examples of online creators asking about the ownership of Slender Man, with artists and authors seemingly nervous about sharing their work for fear of legal reprisal. She also noticed that responses to these questions had no clear answers. She states this uncertainty chills creativity, harms the public by depriving it of more creative works. This, she adds, is why exclusive rights granted to community-created folklore, especially those created online, can have a significantly negative effect on artistic freedom. Smith goes on to say, if a party can claim to own a trademark to Slender Man's name or his image for broad entertainment services, no one else can call their character Slender Man in future works, nor can they use Slender Man's image in their creations. This would effectively quash all creativity involving Slender Man. This type of ownership and exclusivity is the antithesis of the sharing and collaborative culture that first spurred Slender Man's creation. While Smith suggests the Slender Man character, including its name and image, is in the commons, there appears to be no clear way to stop claims of exclusive ownership. Smith looked at a number of ways to prevent exploitation of internet folklore creations, including designating community-based rights or classifying community-made creations as free cultural works, but none of these would be a perfect fit to the problem. For now then, it appears that the creators of works related to Slender Man face continued uncertainty. Janie said earlier that nothing is certain in this life except death and taxes. I'd amend that to nothing is certain in this life except death and taxes and lawyers. with Samhain, Halloween, All Souls Day, the Mexican Day of the Dead, and even Remembrance Day, all fast approaching. This is the time of the year when we remember those who have crossed over the veil. Tonight's practical magic spell is designed to honour our ancestors, perhaps a family member, a dear friend, or a loved one, and to send them a message that we still remember them, care about them, and love them. Though I should emphasise, this is all about you sending a message to them. This is not a séance, and this ritual is not intended to facilitate them talking back to us. This is a ritual that can be conducted either indoors or outside, although the weather may preclude the latter, and should be performed after dark on the evening of the 2nd of November, which, depending upon your beliefs, is All Souls Night or the 3rd night of Samhain. You will need a photograph or keepsake of the people you wish to remember, plus one white candle for each person remembered. And you will need a glass, cup, goblet or tankard of either red wine or cider. Don't worry, it's perfectly acceptable to use non-alcoholic versions of all these drinks. Incidentally, there is no limit, other than the practical constraints of time and space, to the number of people you embrace in this ritual. And you can also conduct it in the company of friends and family members who also have people they wish to remember. Place the pictures or mementos on your altar or in the centre of your sacred space and light the white candle or candles. Then calmly think about those people, about their lives and what they meant to you. Then repeat the following words. This is the night when the gateway between our world and the spirit world is thinnest. Tonight is the night to call out those who came before us. Tonight we honour our ancestors. Then pick up the cup of wine or cider and take a drink from it and toast them with the following words. This is the cup of remembrance. We remember all of you. You are dead but never forgotten, and you live on within us. Then say the name of each person being remembered, followed by merry we meet and merry we part until we meet again. Finally, pour some of the wine or cider onto your altar or onto the earth, somewhere of spiritual significance, as a libation to your gods and goddesses. When you've finished, if it is safe, leave your candles alight until they naturally burn out, or else snuff them out, because your work is done and it is time for the magic to take over. And now here's Janie again to take us urban myth busting. This time we're looking at
Opals. They're the official birthstone for anyone born in October. But over the centuries, a myth has grown up that they are unlucky, and very unlucky for anyone not born in October, which is a bit odd, as the Romans believed its rainbow hues made it a symbol of luck. In fact, our old friend Pliny the Elder was a fan of opals. The Greeks believed it gave you the gift of prophecy. And even as recently as the Middle Ages, women believed that if they wore them in their hair colour would never fade.
So what happened?
The first blow came during the mid-14th century, when the Black Death was sweeping through Europe, when a rumour emerged that an opal would start to lose brilliance when the owner was about to succumb to the plague and would turn dull when they died. See, the reality is opals are a relatively fragile, unstable stone, and they'll turn dull when they deteriorate. So all it took were a couple of plague victims with faded opals and a myth was born.
But I believe there's more to the story.
Oh, yes. And for the greatest blow to the reputation of opals, we have to blame Scottish author Sir Walter Scott and his 1829 novel Anne of Geierstein, where one of the main characters, Lady Hermione, wore an enchanted opal in her hair. And apparently it gave off fiery red flashes when she was angry, and it sparkled beautifully when she was happy. So in the novel, Lady Hermione is accused of being a demoness, and when a few drops of holy water were sprinkled on the gem, it lost its fire and sparkle. At the same time, Lady Hermione became ill and was carried to her room and placed in bed. Next day, all that was found of her and the gem was a heap of ashes in her bed. Now, unbelievably, the public took this as a warning from the author that opals were bad luck. I mean, hello, this was a work of fiction, and they promptly stopped buying opals. Within a few months of the novel being published, opal prices had crashed by around about 50%, and it took over 50 years for the market to recover.
Why did it take so long? I thought Queen Victoria was a fan and dished out opal jewels to all her nearest and dearest.
Well, Queen Victoria may have liked opals, but another European monarch, King Alfonso XII of Spain, made a good job of further trashing its reputation. Now, Alfonso had been in love with an aristocrat called the Comtesse of Castiglione. Evidently, months before the pair were to wed, Alfonso married another woman, his cousin, the Princess Mercedes. But the Comtesse nevertheless sent the couple a wedding present, how kind, in the form of a magnificent opal set in a huge gold ring. The princess was immediately smitten by the gift, apparently, and insisted that her husband slip it on her finger. He obliged, and 6 months later the princess mysteriously died. After the funeral, Alfonso gave the ring to his grandmother, Queen Christina, who almost immediately thereafter also expired. After that, the ring passed to Alfonso's sister, the Infanta Maria del Pilar. Maria died as well, apparently victim to the same weird illness that had taken the other two women. And the ring was up for grabs again, and when Alfonso's sister-in-law expressed an interest, he let her have it, and, you've guessed it, with the usual result. Deeply depressed by then, of course, the king decided to end it all by slipping the ring on his own finger. In a little over a month, in late 1885, the king was also dead. The ring was then attached to a gold chain and strung round the neck of a statue of the patron saint of Madrid, the Virgin Almudena. That put an end to the incredible chain of tragic circumstances. But was the gem really responsible for the calamities besetting this royal family? In fact, cholera was rampant in Spain at the time, with over 100,000 people dying of it during the summer and autumn of 1885. So once again, we have a bad luck tale rising out of a series of unfortunate coincidences. There is one final twist in the story, and that is the jewellery industry itself may have some responsibility for spreading the rumour that opals mean bad luck. Diamond merchants were certainly guilty of spreading stories about opals, particularly once the Australian opal mines began shipping opals to Europe in large numbers. There is also the fact opals are relatively soft, delicate stones, and if a jeweller lacked the appropriate skills, there was a risk an opal might break while being cut, polished or mounted. And that was certainly bad luck for the jeweller. In fact, there are tales of some royal jewellers having their fingers cut off by angry kings after opals they were working on shattered. But to end on a positive note, opals are said to help strengthen the memory, purify the blood and kidneys, regulate insulin, ease childbirth and alleviate PMS. Yeah. Overall, the stone is said to strengthen the immune system and helps the body be resilient to infection.
That's a subtle hint you'd like some opals for Christmas then.
That would be a first. Find us online at www.urbanfantasist.com or email us at urbanfantasist@icloud.com or follow us on Twitter at urban_fantasist.
Time for a ghost story. My own ghost story. Janie was asking me the other day, what did I attribute my lifelong fascination with the paranormal, the occult, and all things supernatural, or at least not exactly supernatural, downright weird. Thinking about it, I believe it was all down to the house I grew up in. My childhood home was Jubilee House, Sandside, located on the Yorkshire coast in England. It was just opposite the main harbour, in fact so close that the cellars sometimes flooded with seawater at a high tide. It was a very old and idiosyncratic building that had been started in the Middle Ages and then extended at the front as the shoreline and the harbour wharf became better established during the Georgian era. Add in the fact it was connected to neighbouring properties, warehouses and sail lofts, which frequently changed ownership, in the process creating a conveyancer's nightmare of flying freeholds. And you'll not be surprised to learn that some of the internal rooms' layouts followed the lines of what the author H.P. Lovecraft would have described as non-Euclidean geometry. At the very top of the house were a series of attics, clad in pantiles over the framework of old ship's timbers, that a psychic friend of my mother's claimed were haunted by the spirits of long-dead mariners, whose ghostly sea boots she could sense going clump, clump, clumping their way across the floorboards on the other side of my bedroom ceiling. Gee, thanks, lady. Now I can lie in bed at night wondering if those clunks I can hear are dead people. The house, incidentally, now has a flat roof, and the seagulls actually do make a surprising amount of noise when they land on it in a typical bad-tempered seagull fashion and start chasing each other around. On the ground floor there was a large kitchen with a big iron range that was occasionally used to boil up pans of crabs and lobsters. I attribute my long-standing preference for showers over baths to the time when, as a toddler, I went into our bathroom only to find the bath filled with very large, very lively, dark blue lobsters, all angrily waving their pincers in my direction, just a few inches from my face. The curious feature of this kitchen area was a section of the wood panelling on the walls. It was hinged, so if you pressed a concealed catch, the panel would swing open to reveal a flight of stairs leading down into what, to me at least, seemed a catacomb-like network of cellars. And, leading off from the cellars, heading in the direction of the basement of the next-door property, was a narrow passageway to nowhere that had clearly been blocked off at some point during its more recent history. According to my father, the passage had been used by smugglers during the previous century. 'Tis of course a convention of any seaport town that all subterranean spaces lying beneath harbourside properties are smugglers' tunnels, even when they are quite clearly Victorian-era coal cellars. However, in this instance, a more likely explanation is the passageway was a place the smugglers' customers used to store their contraband away from the eyes of the customs and excise men. Despite my entreaties, my nagging, my father refused to knock a hole in the wall of the blocked-off passage so we could see what lay beyond. I was rather hoping for buried pirate treasure. Gold doubloons and pieces of 8 and all that. Or maybe even a buried pirate, now no more than a gibbering skeleton after being dealt the black spot and walled up for trying to lead a mutiny. The following year, our neighbours let out their basement, which lay somewhere to the other side of the blocked-off passage, to a snake charmer who operated his show there during the summer season. He also kept a menagerie of exotic creatures in the basement overnight, including a large Burmese python he used for the main part of his snake act. Think Salma Hayek in the movie Dusk Till Dawn, except instead of the lovely Salma, it's a stocky Geordie from Newcastle with a fake Italian accent in a circus strongman's equally fake leopard skin costume. In the event, my father's intransigence proved a blessing the night the python escaped, as it was unable to find its way into our property or under our beds. Most of the weird parts were swept away in the 1960s when the entire property was rebuilt, including the neighbours' adjoining buildings. The whole lot was refashioned and reconstructed. Gone for good were the old attics, the old ground floor kitchen and the concealed cellar, although you can still see traces of the now even further shortened tunnel. But let me tell you about my bedroom. One of my clearest, most chilling and recurring childhood memories is of being woken at night by the sensation of someone or something shaking the wooden footer board at the bottom of my bed. It was as if a hand had grabbed the footer and then sharply jerked it forwards and backwards a couple of times. The first time it happened, I was dozy. I really didn't comprehend what had happened. The second time, I asked if anyone was there. I was still of an age when my parents would look in on me before they went to bed, but received no reply. The third time, I just kept my eyes tightly shut and hid under the bedding as, vivid, morbid imagination that I had even back then, I was convinced it was some form of ghostly manifestation. Perhaps the spirit of one of those dead mariners who haunted the loft, or the reanimated skeleton of that pirate entombed in the passage. Naturally, when a suitable opportunity arose, I asked my father if he could suggest an explanation for these nocturnal manifestations. He thought for a while before positing that it would be the wind hitting the side of the house and, as a consequence, shaking the room and my bed with it. The way he explained it, with the wind blowing along Sandside and catching the exposed side of our house, which projected out from the other buildings, it seemed totally plausible. It made sense to me, and on subsequent occasions, for this went on for years, whenever I felt the bed-shaking sensation, I would just shrug my shoulders and say, "It's just the wind," then turn over and go back to sleep. It was only years later the thought struck me that my father's explanation could not have been correct. Of course it was entirely plausible the wind hitting the side of our house might shake the structure and rattle the casements, but my bedroom was in a part of the house that was sheltered by a neighbouring building, and my bed was placed parallel to the outside wall, so surely that could have only shaken the bed from side to side, not from end to end. Incidentally, my great-grandmother had a couple of interesting brother-in-laws who also lived in the property. They were both fishermen called John and Samson Christian. According to the local newspaper reports of the time, we're looking at the late 19th century, they were either being lauded as heroes for rescuing people from drowning by pulling them out of the harbour, or else being condemned as drunken troublemakers for throwing people into the harbour. In one magistrate's court case, a character witness described them as sober men who never fought unless provoked, which is reminiscent of the line in Herman Melville's novel Moby Dick, that it's better to sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian. Many traditional fairy tales and the legends behind them are actually watered-down, sanitised versions of historical events that have been transformed out of all recognition over the centuries. And, from the 19th century onwards, the moral lessons of these cautionary tales were often more important than the events themselves, as they depicted a world where good conquers evil, and the righteous live happily ever after, and of course the wicked get to be punished, albeit often very cruelly. For example, in the original version of Cinderella, the one Disney and the Christmas pantomimes have rewritten, Cinders doesn't forgive her ugly stepsisters. Instead, they get hung from trees, and the birds peck out their eyes while they are still alive. Recently, I caught up with the Canadian poet, author and general-purpose friend of the fantastic, Colleen Anderson, at the British Fantasy Society's FantasyCon 2017 event, and talked to her about the role of fairy tales and the moral dilemmas in the modern world and how they still offer a rich seam of inspiration to writers.
So in Season's End, which is in Beauty of Death, so it obviously had to have some tale of death in it. I took the Peter Pan and Wendy tale. So Peter Pan, is in Neverland, but I look at Wendy that she was the quintessential kind of mother to all the Lost Boys. She was the girl, and I have her like they're now back in the real world. Time has gone forward. They're hiding in like a complex of warehouses, and she's taking somebody's skin of their face and putting it on him because he's the Green Man. Peter Pan is the Green Man, but he's kind of dying. He's not able to live in the world. They've come back into a polluted world. And so this is the tale of them kind of running and her trying to help him and save him, but his leaves are not growing. Because it's like when you look at some of the Peter Pan stories, the original story, like he's got skeleton leaves, and there's very much the leaves, and that he's a spirit of nature.
Yeah.
And so I have this spirit of nature
Not
who's
so much a green man as a green boy.
a green boy. Yeah, he's that wild nature spirit that's not controlled.
Yeah.
And that was Peter Pan did things. He didn't have boundaries. He was dressed like a little green sprite. But I have them now in the modern world, and it's a slightly future world where things are polluted and the world is dying, and he can't live. He's not getting new buds. He's not going through his seasonal cycle, and she's trying to help him. And they're lovers, but this world is crumbling, and then like there's earthquakes, and everything is bleak and dark, and in the end, she has to kill him. And she has to kill him so that he can regenerate. And he regenerates as the baby that she gives birth to. So it's a bit of that resurrection cycle there, which, very much like even before there was Jesus, there was Osiris, there was Dionysus. There's been a long history of resurrection gods.
Yeah.
And that regeneration myth that's tied into the grain and the earth. And that's, a lot of fairy tales kind of touch on that.
I was going to say it's very much like the European UK Green Man myths that
Absolutely.
Sacrificed and
that's what I played off of.
springs again with the new spring and John Barleycorn and things like that.
Exactly, and that was what I was playing off, that Peter Pan is like the Green Man or the Green Boy, but he can't regenerate when they come back from this Neverland. He's stuck because there's pollution and everything's falling apart, and in the end she must sacrifice what she loves to actually bring about that change. And that like the world also, like there's it's bare skeletal limbs on trees, there's no leaves, like everything's polluted, and all the world is dying, and she has to give that final sacrifice, and she has to kill what she loves to be able to bring that about.
Yeah. Are there any other traditional fairy tales that you've, if you like, taken and adapted for modern age, modern concerns?
Well, I think like with the first manuscript I did, my first novel, where I did kind of deal with the Fae punk. I have my main character is a gypsy, a Roma, so she's a world straddler because she's still human, but she can deal with magic. But I have the Fae creatures where they were the only ones that can control the doorways in the past. So it was always like the legends of the elves, where you don't go into the elven lands and eat anything, or you never come back.
Yeah.
And you may come back, but years have passed.
Yes.
So in this, everybody's dealing with the fact that the world is crumbling, and that the Fae, the elves, they partly exist because people believed in them. And I've run across this in several other stories where, it's our belief that actually generates and keeps these beings alive. So when they're stopped being believed in, they die.
You're going back to Peter Pan again, where the bit where do you believe in fairies to keep Tinkerbell alive?
Exactly, and I think that's kind of an interesting trope. So that's part of the novel, though it also has black holes in it.
Yeah.
But it's also like how would these people be in the future? And in this, like, there's an elf who has left behind his traditions, and he's ostracized because he had some cybernetic techniques. He has a laser eye, and he's kind of abandoned it because he realizes the only way to survive is to blend magic and science together. Mm-hmm. And so there's those that want to keep it pure, and they want to control the doorways. And there's those that went, well, we can't do that. And of course, there's those that want to always use each other. There's the humans. They're kind of Naziistic in that way that they're torturing and experimenting on humans. But there's also the Fae people that are just as bad, because I don't want to have one group that's better than the other.
Yeah. And with your stories, they're very dark, but if you go back to the original versions of traditional fairy tales, which are now children's entertainment, and in the UK, pantomimes. And,
Exactly.
they always have a happy ending. They're very dark as well, aren't they?
They are very dark, Leo. It's like there's a few that may have happy endings, and but it's like Cinderella. They're getting their eyes pecked out. They're getting punished for not being good people.
Yeah.
But there's also the trickster ones, like Jack and the Beanstalk, which is the trickster one, where the trickster is the little man. It's like you even have, like, in Greek myth and that, right? The demigods, or like Hercules, who was started out as human, became a demigod, but they may have trials to do, and they can actually go about those trials. Harry Potter, the Neil Gaiman stories, I mean, they played very much on that age-old trope of the child who's ostracized, that their parents have died, they're alone, they're picked on, and they have to overcome all these odds to become a greater being. So they still manage to stay noble or virtuous in some way. They may have their trials and they may not always succeed, but they can actually overcome those things. And so that's where, Harry Potter's an example of taking that very old fairy tale style and bringing it forward. And Neil Gaiman did that a lot too in his stories. Of course, American Gods, which is now on TV,
Yes. Yeah.
is another example.
Yeah. That's brilliant. Colleen Anderson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're off on another of our history and folklore road trips, and there's a ghost. Last week, Janie and I popped down the road to the South Norfolk village of Thorpe Abbotts to visit the site of the old World War II US Air Force Base, which is the home to the 100th Bombardment Group, part of the US 8th Air Force. They flew B-17 Flying Fortress planes on bombing raids across Nazi Germany and occupied Europe from 1943. The attraction of East Anglia is that it was a relatively flat, thinly populated agricultural area on the bit of England that bulges out into the North Sea, thereby making it a perfect location on which to build airfields, as well as safely store large quantities of bombs, munitions and fuel, away from large towns and cities. And it was also the shortest distance flying-wise from continental Europe. So popular was the location that by the end of the war there were 37 major airfields, plus at least another 40 subsidiary and decoy fields, and over 200,000 US 8th Air Force personnel stationed in East Anglia. It earned the name the Fields of Little America. In fact, one Friday night in September 1944, the legendary band leader Glenn Miller played a gig at Thorpe Abbotts with over 3,000 people packed into the airfield's main hangar to listen and dance to his music. As for the Thorpe Abbotts base, known to the Americans as US Station 139, by the summer of 1943, the American squadron located there had already earned the unfortunate nickname the Bloody Hundredth, for the higher than average number of casualties it sustained. On some raids, over a dozen planes were lost. Each B-47, it should be noted, had a crew of 10. And on one infamous raid over Munster in October 1943, just one plane, Rose's Riveters, returned safely to Thorpe Abbotts. In all, during the course of the war, the Bloody Hundredth lost 177 planes in the course of 306 missions. One suggested explanation is the wheels down incident, when a B-17 lowered its wheels in surrender, then apparently changed its mind and shot down the escorting German fighters, making the 100th a marked outfit for Luftwaffe pilots. Whatever the reason, other American bomber groups like to fly with the 100th because the Nazis go for them instead of us. With the end of the war, Thorpe Abbotts returned to the RAF, and after several years of inactivity, the base was closed and returned to agricultural use. In the years that followed, most of the buildings, hard-standing runways and perimeter track were broken up. However, in 1977, the control tower and several other buildings, including a couple of Nissen huts, or Quonsets as Americans called them, were leased to a group of volunteers who set about restoring the buildings and creating what is now the 100th Bomb Group Memorial Museum. Did I mention the control tower is haunted? From time to time, visitors to the museum report an overpowering presence within the control tower, occasionally accompanied by the brief glimpse of an airman dressed in full flying gear. Although the museum volunteers we spoke to were adamant there was no ghost, they conceded some visitors reported a presence, and another said that while 99% of the noises you hear on an evening could be attributed to natural causes and logical explanations, there were still some things that left you wondering. So what did you think about the place, Janie?
Well, it was very atmospheric there. And I think this is because the control tower is in such a good original condition and it's intact. Walking through the lower floors of the control tower, I felt I was in a museum. But the minute I stood on the outside balcony around the glass tower, I felt I was standing with the men who'd stood there and watched aircraft land and take off. It was a very powerful feeling of their presence still being there, anxiously looking out across the vast airfield, sort of listening and watching the returning aircraft and watching for their fellow airmen.
Interestingly, the haunting is not a new phenomenon, as Eddie the Ghost, as the American personnel called him, first began to appear during early 1944, when he was reported as walking through walls of the airmen's quarters. Stories of the ghost persisted. Eddie was thought to be one of the pilots during Black Week in October 1943, when the group was almost wiped out. And some men were so worried by the ghost that they took to taking their pistols and rifles to bed with them. Fearing an accident, Colonel Thomas Jeffrey, known as Colonel Jeff, the base commander at the time, allegedly banned all talk of Eddie on penalty of court-martial. Today, sightings are less frequently recorded, although Eddie is occasionally seen when the tower is locked at night. It's said he appears at the first floor window, looking out as if to say good night. Although the Americans, with the exception of Eddie the Ghost, left Thorpe Abbotts in 1946, the Bloody 100th are still in East Anglia, now serving as the 100th Air Refuelling Wing out of Mildenhall. Incidentally, the 1949 Oscar-winning movie 12 O'Clock High, which starred Gregory Peck, is based on the missions flown by the 100th and similar groups within the 8th Air Force. For a technical note, the Thorpe Abbotts 100th Bomb Group Museum lies just to the north of the A143 road, midway between the South Norfolk towns of Diss and Harleston. The museum is open weekends and public holidays from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. from the 1st of March to the 31st of October. Admission is free and you can find more details on Google. Almost time to go. Janie and I will be back on Thursday, 2nd November. Good night, thank you, and may your gods and goddesses protect you from ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties and things that go bump in the night. And if the ghost of that American airman at Thorpe Abbotts is listening, good night, Eddie.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon. Which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to Urban Fantasist with Charles Christian, your fortnightly fix of weird tales, urban legends, magic and folklore. Keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com, and on Twitter at urban_fantasist. Good night. Join us again in 2 weeks' time for another edition of Urban Fantasist.